All right, hello and welcome. So today we're gonna switch gears a little bit. What we were talking about last time was the snake here, and a way we can symbolize this is sort of the duality we've been talking about so far. So the square and the circle, we'll say in this one, and this sort of going back and forth of the two opposites. So the best example of this is probably when we talked about the photon that was split, put on one side, one on the other side, and they do converse reactions to each other no matter how far away they are. So this kind of highlights this whole system as a feedback loop. So it doesn't matter where something happens in it, the opposite will automatically happen on the other side. And they'll sort of reinforce each other, and they're sort of dependent on one another. The all-seeing eye, or the triangle that we've been talking about up to this point, is something completely different. In a way, you could probably think of these two sides as there's a corresponding part of your, or like the hemispheres of the brain. So the two sides of the brain kind of go with each one of these ideas, as we talked about. The right side of the brain being more dominant for one side, and the left side of the brain being more dominant with the other side. But this all-seeing eye is not like that. There's no duality. It's just supposed to be is the truth. And this is, of course, Plato's position. And when we were talking about the feedback loop, this would be more of Aristotle's. But we'll see what Plato said about this all-seeing eye. In every man there is an eye of the soul spirit, which is more precious than 10,000 bodily eyes. For by it alone is truth seen. And the way that Plato said we can kind of see into this world, and without sort of connection with our spiritual self, this soul or spirit, is through geometry. And with his academy, so Aristotle had something called a lyceum, and Plato had something called an academy, and it's where we get our word for academy today as well. But this is what was printed, or supposedly on outside the building, is that no one ignorant of geometry enter. And geometry is one of these sort of hands into the invisible, that we can understand this world that is not reinforced as this feedback loop world is, which would be more, again, for Aristotle. So let's take a look at some examples here. Well, I guess this isn't really so much an example, it's just more reinforcing the same idea. So maybe you've heard of this before, but these are called the Platonic solids. And this is supposed to, these three-dimensional shapes are kind of ways of representing perfection in geometry and how they can be replicated in the world. So this one's supposed to represent fire. This one's supposed to represent air. This is supposed to be earth, I believe. And this one's supposed to be water. And these Platonic solids is something we'll talk about a lot in the future, but for now we'll just kind of introduce them, and we'll get back to them eventually. And this one's supposed to represent space, I believe, or the ether, the holy air. But they're all dependent on one another. And like I say, we'll get back to this at some point. So if we can look at another very famous name, Galileo Galilei, Nature's grand book, which stands continually open into our gaze, is written in the language of mathematics. So there's no way to like see this with your bodily eyes. You have to find it in a different way. Its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is impossible for humanity to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around a dark labyrinth. So a labyrinth's sort of a maze. So he's saying that even though these are people that were really good at understanding the physical world, they understood that the deeper truth was more like this. And they had to understand this well enough to understand the physical world afterwards. And we'll give you lots of evidence to support that yet. So quantum physics and physics is the way I think of it. We kind of split these two sides up in these two different ways. But again, like I said, this is the same fight that's been going on since probably earlier than these two. But quantum physics is best represented sort of, and not as clear cut as just one is one and one is the other, but quantum physics is closer to related to Plato, and then physics is more related to Aristotle and the logical consequences of what they talk about anyway. And a good example of how this quantum physics works and how it shows that the physics world is this feedback loop that we talked about. I think my next picture shows that again. This feedback loop is that it's without time. And we talked about the one aspect of Greek time, which was kairos. So chronos, like chronological, is supposed to be, chronos is going throughout time, linear time. And then kairos is this non-linear time, this time that sort of always is. And the quantum physics one, the one that's represented by Plato in this all-seeing eye that we talked about, we can kind of give an example of this, a famous experiment where somebody was putting a bunch of people in a room, and I'll link to the actual study in the somewhere in the comments, or maybe underneath it in the description. But anyway, the basic premise is they had this person in this room, and in random intervals, so it was set up to a computer, and in random intervals this horn would go off. And what they did, even though the horn was going off in completely random times, what they did is hooked up the individual's skin to show a galvanic response. A galvanic response is like your body's reaction, sort of this closing in of your body of a fearful reaction. And the interesting thing they found, and related to this kairos time, is that the body's galvanic response reacted before the actual random siren went off. And this would seem impossible if you just believe in normal just physics. The fact that your body can anticipate these things, but keep in mind that sort of same idea we were talking about with the photon split in two. One will actually anticipate the other one, and this gets back to this whole situation of these two opposites as being a feedback loop. And a way we can kind of relate this to some bigger names that we may know in history. Freud's known for this iceberg analogy. And a really good friend of Freud was Jung here. We don't need to write the name, we all know Freud. But was Jung, and they were good friends, but there was a couple things that they sort of split on. And Freud was unwilling to be as sort of mystical minded as Jung was. And Jung kind of is on the periphery of science and his own perspective field, because he kind of went into this world a little bit. But the way Freud saw it is that the ego or conscious thought is sort of the top of the iceberg, and then unconsciousness is this huge amount around it. And in a way, we could say Freud sort of saw the water as our sexual urges, as these sort of inherent sexual urges we had. But Jung really didn't see it that way. Jung saw this as superconsciousness. The sort of water that creates all of this is a superconsciousness. And I'm going to relate this to our all-seeing eye. So this superconsciousness, which everybody shares, in which there's no time, in which everything can be, there can be an awareness at all of these things at once. I think a good person to listen to as far as the way he anticipated, and another person that I think was sort of a mystical-minded person, was Bruce Lee. And Bruce used to say in one of his most famous quotes was, "Empty your mind, be shapeless, formless, like water." And when we get stuck as thinking of ourselves as an iceberg, that's when we limit ourselves. And we'll give examples of this coming up in a moment here. But I think this is a really good way to think of it as well. So be shapeless, be formless, be like water. Be like that all-seeing self, which is independent of space and time. The way we can use this with the analogies we've given so far, I sort of gave you this example of the ego being like a rider of an elephant that's going to try to impose his own will with the elephant, and the elephant will do what that person wants up to a certain point until he gets fearful or whatever else, or gets hungry. They won't listen to the person giving it feedback. And we can think of this as an individual. So this is sort of like the iceberg. This is the top of the iceberg. This is what's below the water of the iceberg. But the superconsciousness can lead both of these. but this one has to not try to impose his own will in it. So we can see metaphorically this is represented by this little boy here. And he's giving direction to the elephant and just kind of having him respond to what is natural and can guide it if he wants to. Another way to think of this is sort of the way the spider spins its web. So there's unbelievable amount of variations within a spider's web, but there's this sort of grand design that's always a reference point. And obviously a spider's not consciously thinking about this, and yet it sort of creates it without trying. And that'll be something we're going to talk about time and time again, is this lack of try. So that little person that rides the elephant is always trying to make his own will. But the spider is just doing what comes natural to it. And there's a lot of examples we can give of people doing this same sort of thing and having better results at times without trying. Ant communities are sort of the same idea. And the complexity of some of these, this is when they pour cement into the community and sort of get an idea of the feel. And what's really interesting about it is there's sort of a grand design to it. Like, I mean, sort of like the spider's web, they're responding to the conditions that are in the soil, and they're responding to their needs. But at another time, they sort of respond like one organism. So we can see things like certain spacing between chambers and certain access to air if the chamber needs the air. This is more than just an individual ant thinking. They're responding like one organism. And a good example of this is some fish do this as well, but this is, I believe it's starlings. They sort of respond to each other as one organism. And there's actually examples of the Portuguese man-o'-war, which is supposedly several species just working together as one organism in order to mutually benefit. So just like your body, like, I mean, this isn't really too different from your body. Your body's comprised of many cells which are all organized to work towards one cause. Another example of people not trying, I'll link this as well, but this is a documentary about this gentleman here, and when he was doing this, or what he's doing at this moment, is reciting pi up to 2,500 decimal points, or maybe it was 1,500, I can't remember exactly the number, but unbelievable amounts anyway. And the way that he conceived numbers wasn't really a trying process. There's no conscious control of what he did. He visualized certain numbers as being certain shapes and colors, and sometimes there'd even be sounds associated with them. And he'd get something like, he'd say, okay, 32, and then they give him another number, and they'd say, okay, times that by 141. And he would, and obviously these shapes are just completely random to me. I do not have this ability. But then he'd say he'd just see a shape take form in between the two. And that shape was the answer to the equation, whatever they were asking. And there's zero effort involved in this. Like, I mean, he has to guide his mind, but there's not really an effort to, like, okay, grind through these numbers and try to make something. And it was quite remarkable. If you watch the documentary again, I'll link it. But it's pretty incredible what he could do, and some of these very complex mathematical equations. And another one they talked about in that movie was this guy that was hit in the head when he was a kid with a baseball. And then he could tell every day since that day that happened, he could tell what, if you give him a date, so February 13th, he'll tell you, okay, it was a Thursday, and he'll tell you what the weather was on that day. And he says, I can't explain it. It just pops right into my head. And what this kind of reminds me of is, I remember listening to, and this is all getting back to that idea of try and not try. I think that goes back to Yoda. But artists talk about writing for the garbage can. So they'll grind themselves over trying to write a song. And then when they say when it works the best, though, is just when they just give this active release and just write as though they're never going to use it and just let it be free-flowing. And an example, there's a lot of examples of it with books as well. So something like Little Women, where it just wasn't really written for a reason. It was just a flow of her own life, and she just let it out and didn't really have any plans for it beyond maybe putting it out, but it really wasn't something she grinded through or anything else when she was writing it. But I hear the same story with a lot of artists as well. as far as musicians, for just not trying, and some of their best songs coming within 10-15 minutes of just writing it in one sitting, not thinking about it, and just letting it come out. Interesting aspect of this, and this is done at Princeton University, so a very famous university. This is Sotomayor, so a really famous judge in the United States, and JFK, and some of the most famous people in the United States went to this very prestigious university. They have something called the Global Consciousness Project. And just as I was mentioning before, they sort of have random generators, number generators, and they'll watch effects of the world, or things going on in the world, influencing these random number generators. So, for example, when 9/11 happened, they said there was a huge spike in non-random activity that came up during that time. And it was sort of, actually, my bar is kind of weird here. I think it kind of went like this. So the non-random activity sort of spiked and then came down slowly. But when 9/11 happened, just like we were talking about some of the other examples, 9/11 happened somewhere like here. So the consciousness, the global consciousness, supposedly, and this is always up for debate, obviously, but anticipated it happening. Just like we were talking about the galvanic response of the human skin before a random horn went off. There's something that knows without space and time when something is coming in time. And there's no other really good scientific explanation if we think of it as Aristotle would, is that feedback loop as being reality and chronological time being reality. Another one would be the Stargate project. So this is a physicist here. His name is Russell Targ. We'll talk about him a little bit here yet. And Russell was involved in this program when he was a physicist, and this is a laser that he created that was supposedly one of the best of the time, and got the government interested in bringing him on as one of the scientists working for the government. But what they eventually directed him into was doing remote viewing. So for those of you that don't know, remote viewing is looking at different places in the world without going there. So somebody's in a room, they'll give them coordinates and they'll be able to see the spot. Or they'll be able to ask them to find some individual, and they'll be able to see. And this, obviously this sounds impossible, but their success would prove, and keep in mind the program ran for 23 years, their success, and we'll talk about that in a moment, would say that there's pretty good evidence that it was real and that it did work. But one of the quotes he gave is, "It's not more difficult for people to describe something in remote Siberia than it is to describe something in my pocket." It's sort of, it doesn't matter where in the world something is, and the person will be able to remote view it, directing their consciousness to find it. And sometimes they would jump forward or back into the past. The example he gave was one of his peers looking in a building that they were trying to find and trying to make it identifiable to explain it to somebody, and he just went back in the past 75 years to make it more, when it stood out more in time. And some rather large claims, but he had a lot to support it. And I mean, this is a very rationally, scientifically minded person, but I think the fact that he's a physicist probably keeps his mind open to just seeing observable results, because physicists sometimes deal with not just tangible reality, but rather just numbers and theories. So I think there's not a coincidence that a lot of these people that get into this were physicists. And like I say, the program ran for 23 years. And with some of the people, there was obviously some that were more gifted than others, but they talk about effect size and about how something is scientifically not random. And the worst of them kind of went at 1.6 here. So this would be a medium effect size, which is pretty good. And there were some that went all the way past what the upper limit is here, 1.5 effect size, which is massive as far as if you're going to believe in science and observable reality showing something that is scientifically true, then you're going to, if you're going to ignore this success they had, you're going to have to ignore most of science as well. But a lot of them, actually I cut off the little spot here, there was they drew this in there too, but they would draw a picture of some of these places that they were trying to find and give in remarkable detail the way some of these things worked. So Russell, tying everything together, this is Russell's quote, and as a physicist, it might seem a little bit odd, but this, I think, hits the nail on the head. If you think you're a person you see in the mirror in the morning, you're in for a lot of suffering, in my opinion. What you really are is non-local awareness, independent of space and time. And this gets back to that idea of kairos. So this is chronological time, this feedback loop, this all-knowing, all-seeing I is something completely different. But it's kind of overlaid on it. But we have this circle in the center that we've been talking about all the way along that's sort of timeless. And this gets back to that idea we talked about last day about the Virgin Mary coming out of the center of this. So when we showed this before, and the shape will make a lot of sense in a moment here. But for now, just know that that shape that we showed Virgin Mary, and we'll show this picture again here in a second, is very significant because this is sort of the circles on either side, and they overlap in the center. And some of these ones are the ones we talked about with Virgin Mary in the center, and this is called the Mandalora. And when they show Jesus, though, typically it's the top and the bottom. And maybe you've seen this shape when they talk about the fish. So we can go like this, and we can see that sort of Jesus fish that maybe you didn't understand what they were trying to convey at that moment. But you can see that he's sitting on, and a lot of this you can see in the background here. So this one's kind of a mix of the two. But you can see the bottom circle on the bottom here. And there's more dimensions than just the two like we see here. There's also a top and bottom, which we're going to get into next lecture. But Jesus is usually showing him sitting, his mind in top, but his body in the lower sphere. And that'll make a lot more sense eventually. But for now, we'll just leave it as is. But keep in mind, and you can sort of see this Mandalore shape, and this is obviously a bunch of different fields coming together to do this. So mathematics, and again, these very abstract fields, mathematics, geometry, and I can't remember the third one, but they all came together and came up with this shape that seemed to be mathematically supportable, although not tangibly supportable. But anyway, we'll leave it there today. This is some pretty out there stuff, but I think I kind of supported it fairly well, but there'll be more to come if you're not completely convinced yet. But I wish you a good day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.